Welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryen, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Before we go to our guest, Dr. Stephen Bryen, here is your JPC commercial. We were established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. We support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of our democratic ally, Israel, against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles, our magazine In Focus Quarterly, and our blog In Context. You can also find our previous webinar programs. Some of you have been with us on these programs since early 2020. We've done China more than once, Israel more than once, Iran, Turkey, domestic security, the defense budget, the Supreme Court, and homeschooling. We took a look at the short war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and America's hasty and ill-executed exit from Afghanistan. All of those are on the website. Today, our guest is Dr. Stephen Bryen. And yes, for those of you who asked, we are related. A senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and the Yorktown Institute, Steve is an expert in security, strategy, and technology. He has held senior positions in DoD, on Capitol Hill, and is president of a large multinational defense and technology company. He's a prolific writer, and his articles appear everywhere you think they would, and some places you wouldn't think they would, here and abroad. He has published 6 books on technology and security subjects, including Technology, Security, and National Power, and Security for Holy Places. And he's contributed to a number of studies on national security and defense. You've probably seen him in our magazine, In Focus Quarterly, and in our insight columns. If you haven't, go find them on the website, jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. How's that for getting in an extra mention of the website address?
Very good.
With decades of experience in government and industry, Steve has served as Senior Staff Director at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy, founder and first director of the Defense Technology Security Agency Administration, DTSA or DTSA, and a commissioner on the U.S.-China Security Review Commission. He is twice the recipient of the highest civilian award of the Pentagon. He took his expertise to industry as president of Finmeccanica North America, a multinational defense and technology company. The late, great Morley Safer of 60 Minutes once said of him, Dr. Bryen was the Pentagon's top cop, the man whose job it was to ensure sensitive technology would be kept from our enemies, our potential enemies, and from questionable allies. So how are we doing? Dr. Stephen Bryen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We're not doing very well. And if I could talk to Morley today, I would tell him how bad it is, because there's a lot we can be doing. And I think the situation with Iranian drones is a great example. So what I'd like to do today is to put on a little slideshow. I was trained in the Pentagon, and in the Pentagon, you can't talk without doing a slideshow. So you're going to have to suffer with it, but I think it'll be helpful. And we'll take a look at some of these Iranian drones, and maybe one Russian one too, and then see what might be done about them. By the way, today I have an article in Asia Times about an Iranian drone, one of the ones we're going to discuss, that hit an Israeli-owned oil tanker in the Persian Gulf just 2 days ago. So if you have an opportunity, take a look at it. Let me share the screen now, if I can, and push a few buttons. And there we are. And if I can get it to the slideshow, maybe I can't, but you can follow it this way. So let's talk about stopping Iran's drone program. And by the way, I'm bringing the expertise I have in this is I spent 8 years, almost 8 years in the Defense Department, trying to stop technology from going to the then Soviet Union. And we were pretty successful at the end of the day. So I know a little bit about how you go about it and what you do. I ran a large team, about 130 people, and they did a wonderful job for the United States. Now, Iran is producing thousands of drones, thousands, not hundreds, but thousands. And they're sending them all over the place to Russia, which you know about now, to Ethiopia, to Venezuela, to Sudan, and of course in the Middle East, to Lebanon and Syria, just to name some of the places. They have built up a network of customers among nations and proxy groups, including in Yemen and Lebanon, but also in Gaza and in Syria. They've also set up offshore production in Syria and Lebanon and Venezuela and Tajikistan. So they're making their drones in various places. And this is a trick, actually, so that they can protect their manufacturing capabilities by putting them in different places. In late October, Israel struck the Dimas military airport in Syria, which is a base of operations for Iran-backed forces and Hezbollah that has been ramped up in recent months as Iranian drone shipments started to roll in. So they're very busy there, and it's a real threat to Israel, just as it's a real threat to Ukraine and to many other places. Now, Russia has ordered 1,700 unmanned aerial vehicles of different types. And they're using it right now to primarily attack the infrastructure of Ukraine. Even today, this morning, there were over 100 more cruise missiles and drones fired by the Russians, taking out a number of power plants, a factory, some apartment blocks, and other buildings in Ukraine. One of the features of Iran's drones is they're cheap. The Shahed 136, by the way, that's the same one that hit the oil tanker in the Persian Gulf, which features a distinctive triangular wing and operates autonomously. It carries a warhead of 80 pounds. It's a good size, and it's designed to explode on impact. These units cost about $20,000 each, which is, for a drone, very cheap. And while Russia also produces, these are called suicide drones, and while Russia also produces its own suicide drone called the Kub, K-U-B, loitering munition, they don't compare in range or in the warhead size to the Iranian ones, which is the reason Russians are buying them from Iran. Now, we're going to talk about two Iranian drones that have been shipped to Russia for use in Ukraine. And we'll also mention a little bit about one Russian drone. The two we're going to cover is the Shahed 136, that's the smaller one, and the bigger one, which is called the Mujahar 6. Here's just a little video clip. You can see the Mujahar drone. It's got a pusher propeller. It's made mostly of plastic.
A series of indigenous drones.
And
These drones are made only for reconnaissance operations, but Mujahar 6 can conduct combat operations.
You can see it dropping a missile.
Mass production of it began after the Iranian Defense Ministry delivered the homegrown military aircraft to the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps.
And that tells you who runs it in Iran, by the way. And by the way, it was the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps that hit the Israeli tanker 2 days ago. Now, while Iran says its drones are homemade, homegrown, and made entirely of domestically produced parts, the truth is quite different than that. The drones combine American, European, Asian, and Chinese parts and software, and I'm going to show you some of that. Iran's drones use laser target designators, some from the United States, GPS receivers, mainly from China, and engines either from Europe or China. Now, I think the U.S. has a golden opportunity stop Iran's drone programs by blocking the supply of critical parts. The cheaper Iranian drones like the Shahed 136 depend on engines from China. The more elaborate drones, particularly the Mohajer 6, uses an engine made in Austria, supplied by a company that's controlled by the United States. So let's take a look what I'm talking about. First of all, I am in the wrong place. This is the Mohajer 6 drone. You can take a look at it. It has a number of parts from a Hong Kong firm, parts from Texas Instruments and Linear Technologies, which are American companies, optical and infrared cameras that come from Asia and the United States, and an engine, the Rotax 912. It's a 100 horsepower engine that comes from Austria. It's the engine I'm going to focus on in a minute. Now, Mohajer 6 is a knockoff of an intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance and attack drone combo, very similar to the Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2. The Bayraktar drone, you may recall, was heavily used in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and it was very successful. It did a great deal of damage to the Armenian forces. And both the Turkish drone and the Iranian one use the same engine built by the Austrian firm Rotax. Now, Rotax was bought actually some years ago by Bombardier of Canada and spun off as part of a group called the Bombardier Recreational Products Group, or BRP. BRP, in turn, was bought by Bain Capital in the United States. They own 50% of it. The Bombardier family, which owns 35%, and the Caisse de Dépôt and Placement de Quebec, 15%. So Bain Capital, based in Boston, basically controls it. And one of Bain's co-founders, just so I'm sure you'd like to know, is Senator Mitt Romney. So this hits home, and we'll take a closer look yet further on. Now, the Rotax engines were supplied by Rotax through its distributor in Italy to Iran, although the Italian distributor says it didn't do that. And I don't really accept that. I think it's pretty clear where they came from. And Rotax itself says it never supplied engines to Iran for military purposes. Well, you can supply them for civilian purposes and stick them in a drone. I mean, this is a silly kind of thing for them to say. The truth of the matter is they're providing plenty of them to the Iranians. Now, they shouldn't be doing it because of the sanctions, but they're doing it anyway. And we have seen wrecked Mohajer UAVs in Ukraine with the Rotax engine in them, so there's no secret here. Iran also has an authorized repair facility in Iran called Mahada Wing. This is from the website of Mahada Wing. So if you look it up on your internet, you can go and visit the website. So it was a straightforward operation. The Austrian firm was making them, supplying through a distributor in Italy to Iran. Iran had a service center which it set up, authorized by Rotax. And this is how they play the game. This is a photo of one of the Rotax engines from a Mohajer 6 drone recovered in Ukraine. And I don't think there's any doubt that the name Rotax is completely visible. And this is a unique engine. It's not something that you can replace very easily with another engine from somewhere else. Now, I think the U.S. says Iran is violating U.S. sanctions by delivering drones to Russia, which is probably the case, which means that a U.S.-controlled company is violating the sanctions as well. So how come Washington hasn't put sanctions directly on these engines? And I ask this not rhetorically, but I ask it as why hasn't Washington simply put a stop to it? The president can do this in various ways. He can just ask the Commerce Department and the Defense Department to do it by directly, or he can put out an executive order. There's nothing to prevent this from being blocked. And because of the ownership, which is American, there's no doubt that we can cover it. But anyway, the EU has the same sanctions, and Austria is in the EU. The EU agrees that Iran is breaking UN sanctions on drone deliveries to Russia. So that problem is off the table. So in short, if we want to, we can immediately block any further deliveries of engines and spare parts to Iran. Now, the engine, I think, is all important because the drone can't fly without it, and there aren't really any good substitutes. And the ones that are out there are all either in Europe or Australia. The Chinese don't really make an equivalent engine with the right amount of power to run this drone. They would have to redesign the drone and that would take some time. But even there, I think China can be persuaded to cooperate. And I'll talk more about that in a while. The electronics, by the way, of the Mohujer 6, I'm not really covering them in any depth today, are largely American. Here's a couple of photographs of two devices. This is an analog device, a video processor, and this is a field programmable gate array made by Xilinx. The chip is actually made in Taiwan for Xilinx, but is distributed by Xilinx. And I want to point out that the circuit board that these are mounted on is a very sophisticated one. It was not produced in Iran. It is likely that it was produced either in Asia or even possibly in the United States. It's a custom board, but it's a well-done professional job, certainly not done in Iran, which doesn't have this kind of capability. Now, this is the Shahed 136. This is a suicide drone. And it's gotten a new name recently, the Giron 2, or Giron, I'm not sure which is the Russian pronunciation, because the Russians have modified it. As you can see, it has a 40 kilogram or 80-pound warhead. It has a pretty good range now of about 600 miles, and the cost of this drone is about $20,000. Here is an engine. You can see it from top down, looking down. It's a 4-cylinder Chinese engine. Probably this one is made by DLE in China. Nothing particularly special about the engine, except that it's Chinese, and the Chinese are supplying them in very large numbers to Iran. Once again, as we've discussed, and by the way, this is the DLE 222 engine company, the Miller Huajing technology company. It does business in the United States. It does business all over Europe. Now, the engine specifically is not controlled by standard export controls, but it's controlled by sanctions, the sanctions on Russia that are effective today. So if the United States approaches China and says, look, we don't want you to sell these engines anymore, we want to cut it off, I believe the Chinese would cooperate. By the way, here's the Chinese engine, new and from the factory. Now, China says it will not supply war materials to Russia during the Ukraine war. In fact, they're doing it. And I think that given the now new cooperation with China that has just been agreed at the G20 summit, that this is the right time to approach the Chinese and ask them to not supply. Of course, we have to clean up our own act as well. Now, let's take a little side trip here to a Russian drone called the Orlan 10. And I'm putting it up because I think it's interesting. It also is made of French, Swiss, and Japanese parts with US electronics. France is supplying the thermal imaging camera of the Orlan. Orlan is being very heavily used in the Ukraine war by the Russians. It's not an attack drone. It doesn't drop bombs or do anything like that. But what it does do is it allows the Russians to use it to target their rockets and other cruise missiles and even their other drone, their suicide drones, for example, on Ukrainian targets. Switzerland supplies the GPS, the Global Positioning System module, which includes the US and US GPS system and the Russian GLONASS, which is their GPS system. And Japan supplies the engine and the engine's electronic controls. Here we can see a couple of Russians working on the Orlan 10. It's not a very big drone. And here we can see the engine, and you can very clearly see the name Saito, which is the Japanese company that makes the engine and the electronic ignition system, which you can clearly see in the photo. This is one, again, that was recovered in Ukraine. Now, this is another little gem that's in the Orlan drone. This is a very sophisticated infrared detector chip that is called the Pico 640 Gen 2. This chip is very expensive. It costs something like $7,000 each. So you can imagine if you're producing a lot of drones, it's going to be quite pricey. And these come from France. And the company that makes them, which is now has taken on a new name, Linred, is the only European infrared manufacturer that already has its detectors deployed in space. It's a very sophisticated piece of equipment that the Russians are using in their drones. I don't know if it's not being used also in Iranian drones. This is something we have to investigate, but I wouldn't be surprised. So what I want to tell you today is I've only shown you essentially the tip of the iceberg here. Iran is importing a lot of technology from the West and from China for its drone program. Without that technology, it's out of business. I believe that there's at least significant evidence, and I'm sure that the Pentagon and the CIA have a lot more, that Iran has a very in-depth worldwide acquisition network that feeds its drone programs and probably other Iranians' weapons programs. I haven't investigated the others. And the way we learn about this is when the stuff crashes and we take it apart. So otherwise you don't learn anything. But even the Israelis, I think, understand where this stuff is coming from. I don't think Iran has a microelectronics capability of its own. I think they're weak in electro-optics, and some of the specialized avionics and gyros and things like that, they have to import. They don't make them. So it seems to me that we have this great opportunity to stop all this if Washington can be persuaded to get its act together. So I've come up with kind of 4 steps that I invite you to consider. First of all, the number 1, cut off all electronic supplies to Iran and Russia. And this can be done by law under the UN sanctions, the Russian sanctions, or by executive order. Secondly, inform our allies and friends that sanctions plus the executive order apply to them. If they cheat, the US will act punitively against them. I know that sounds rough, but the truth of the matter is that we can persuade our allies. They have very little skin in the game. And I think if we ask them to cooperate, they will do it. The problem is no one's asked them. At least that's what it seems like to me. And also, given the importance not only of the US market, but the American security umbrella, I think they would comply willingly. Those that won't comply can be dealt with in other ways. Third step, ask China to stop selling tons of drone materials to both Russia and Iran, as these materials are fueling the war in Ukraine. China says that it doesn't want to fuel the war in Ukraine. Let's hold them to that declaration. And while China might lose face with their Russian and Iranian allies, the Chinese will understand that the US and the EU have the option of tough sanctions if China doesn't comply. And finally, and most importantly, mobilize the FBI and the CIA to go to work against the Iranian and Russian technology acquisition networks. Both agencies, I think, have lots of information in hand which they can start working from. But they need marching orders, and marching orders like this come from the White House. So it's really up to the president to take this step, but I don't understand why he wouldn't, since it's in the United States security interest, it's in the world security interest to make it more difficult for Russia to conduct the war in Ukraine. So I think I will stop there. Let me see if I can get stop sharing the screen. And I'm available for any questions.
And we have some questions.
I thought so.
Thank you for what was an enlightening and depressing presentation. So I'm going to try to put a couple of questions together. We've had people signing in while you were talking.
Okay.
The first is a combination of two. How long has the US government understood that the Iranians were importing things from Europe and the US and Japan and all these other places? So how long have we known this? And then secondly, doesn't CFIUS have to approve of exported dual-use technologies? Don't these things fall for the US and US companies under the dual-use label? Is it just that the administration doesn't care?
All right, two things. There's two questions there, so let's see if I can answer them. In regard to the last question, which has, it's not CFIUS, but it's the Export Control Administration of the Commerce Department that has primarily regulates this kind of trade, or the Treasury Department, which is called the OFAC, which deals with sanctioned technology. This is not normally export controlled technology. This is sanctioned technology. It falls under the U.S. sanctions on Russia and whatever is left of the sanctions on Iran. So it would probably be Treasury Department that would have the lead here if they are given the marching orders that I talked about. The first part of the question would remind me.
How long have we known this is going on?
How long? Yeah, I think we certainly knew it by the time the Saudi oil fields were hit by the same drones, the Shahed drones, and cruise missiles also, because we were able to get our hands on those drones. So I imagine that that's now more than a year ago. So we've known at least that long. I think we probably have known even longer than that. Look, if you take that Rotax engine as an example, those were being supplied by the Austrian company during the Nagorno-Karabakh war to the Azerbaijanis through Turkey, and at one point the Canadians told Rotax stop sending them. So they understand where these drones are going, and I'm sure they have a good book on them.
Yeah, I'm going to put together two others. To what extent is Ukraine a test bed, possibly, for Iran's intentions to use drones against Israel in the future? And it's not just the future. Obviously, you've talked about an Iranian drone that hit an Israeli ship already. And the second part of that question relates to China, because you said that China could be induced to stop doing it because they don't want to fuel the war in Ukraine. However, maybe they're using it as a test bed for what could be done to Taiwan in the future. So how much of this relates to future plans by nasty people?
There's plenty of nasty people in the world.
There are, and they have.
I think that one thing that I didn't talk about, but I think it's very significant. Let's take the Shahed 136 drone and the Russian modifications to it. And then the people don't have to understand that the Russians modified it, and it's called the Geron 2 now. They're being produced, however, modified way in Iran. So the Russians already saw some shortcomings in the Iranian drones, and improvements they thought were needed to extend the range and to do some other things. Take a look at my Asia Times article today. So they changed it around, and those modifications then were done by the Iranian manufacturer. So yeah, they're learning a lot from that. They're also learning how good air defenses are against their drones and ways to avoid them. So from a war war operations point of view, they're learning how to improve their drones. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more. So tactically, operationally, the war is helping them learn a lot that they can use against Israel or anybody else they don't like. They use them against Saudi already many times. They use them through the Houthis against Saudi. They use them against. They've used them against the Kurds in northern Iraq. So there's plenty of places where they're getting experience. As far as China is concerned, I think it's less because, first of all, China has its own drones. They don't need Iranian drones. How much reporting back they're getting from either the Russians or the Iranians, I don't know. Presumably they're getting it, but I just don't know how much. But they'll learn some things. I think one of the issues for all drone makers today is securing the data links, the radio links, and the GPS systems from jamming or from other kinds of interference. And that's one of the things that I think we'll see more and more improvements in the future.
So a listener has asked, this may be impossible to know, but he asks it anyway. There's a question about the inventory of key components that might already be inside Iran or might already be inside Russia. Is there any way to understand what the future of the programs look like? Even if we take the steps we need to take, how long can those programs go on?
I thought about that too. I mean, that's a tough one. Obviously, they have an acquisition network and they're buying things and warehousing them, so we don't know how much. But if they want to stay in business, they're going to have to parse them out, to the Russians or keep them for themselves. So they're going to have to limit the numbers. When you get to the Rotax engines, I really don't think they have much of an inventory. I think they have to get those on a regular basis from Austria. They're not mass produced in that sense. So chips are another story. But I think we need to learn more. But that's why I sort of focused on the engines, because that's a place where we can have a more immediate impact.
Okay, a couple more. Is it possible that Western intelligence agencies have already compromised the drones? Is there a way to use cyber attacks against either the drone factories or the drones themselves? And second question, Israel has already attacked Iranian drone factories in Syria, as you mentioned. Right. Is that enough to disrupt the supply chain at all? Or is it so far spread that we can't do it without attacking, I don't know, Venezuela?
I don't know that. I never heard of any drone factory in Iran being attacked either through cyber means or by warfare means. I mean, no one's touched it. They've been doing this for quite some time. Clearly, the Israelis are trying to chase the Iranians out of Syria and Hezbollah out of Syria as well, and to limit their capabilities. So whenever they bring in long-range drones or armed drones or kamikaze drones or anything else, they're going to try and knock them off. And they do. I wish we would do the same thing, but we don't.
But that's it, right? The Israelis attack the ones in Syria, and no one is attacking drone capabilities anywhere else?
Not that I can tell. I haven't seen any evidence of it. And the fact is that they're exporting these things to the Houthis and to Hamas and to Hezbollah and other places. So yeah, even Venezuela, where they're making them too. That's what we need.
Just what we need in our hemisphere. Iranian drones have been used against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, haven't they?
Yes, they have.
How have we responded to that?
We haven't. Plain and simple. I mean, we have very limited capabilities for our own military people. Let me give you an example. We've just urgently sent the Avenger air defense system to Ukraine. There's only a couple of those systems built. One of them is used to protect the White House, but we've urgently sent them off to Ukraine. Did I say Syria before? I meant Ukraine.
No.
sent them off to Ukraine to defend against things like the Iranian drones. But we didn't give them to our own soldiers, make any effort. In fact, they have almost no real credible air defense capabilities for example, in our deployments in Iraq or in Syria.
So leaving us vulnerable to things.
Yeah, I mean, it's disgusting, but the truth of the matter is that we have left our troops mostly unprotected. There's some systems there, but not very good ones. We're mostly unprotected, and we have not done what we should have been doing there.
That's slightly off the topic, but that's a really important thing to understand, that we have service people deployed in places where we're not.
That's right. Yeah.
And okay, in line with that, here's a question. How do US drones compare with what you've seen of the Iranian and Russian versions? If we're not protecting ourselves, do we at least have offensive capabilities with our own drones?
Well, US drones typically are much more sophisticated than the ones you see from Iran and Russia. And they're made, they're more advanced. Whether we're talking about really fancy ones, the Reaper or the Predator drones, which are very high altitude and can do lots of bad things to the enemy, or we're talking about tactical drones. But we are more focused on sort of the counterterrorism kind of drones we have been in the past than we have been focused on warfighting drones, which I think is probably a mistake, because it's looking more and more like we have to be focused on warfighting drones. We used the Predators and Reapers to kill people like Soleimani and that kind of operation, and it works very well. It's a piece of genius, actually. Incidentally, the Predator really was an Israeli design that Jim Woolsey took out to General Atomics and got them to build it on the come, and then the CIA said, "Oh, this is really neat. We need it." So I mean, but the point here, and Israel, of course, has been one of the pioneers in drone development. But I think Israel used them for combat primarily, where the U.S. has used them primarily for counterterrorism. And I think that in future, drones, as Nagorno-Karabakh first proved, drones are going to play a big role in warfare unless people find a way to shoot them down efficiently, which doesn't exist right now. And so from a combat point of view, the U.S. has to refocus. We have all the capabilities, but we have to refocus our efforts in that field, because that's where the action is going to be in future.
So you mentioned Israeli technology in the early drones. Israel was a pioneer in drones, started with a model airplane club, actually, many years ago. Listener writes in that Israeli technology was discovered in Iranian drones used in Ukraine. Do we know anything about
No, I never heard that.
that network happened?
No, I don't think that's right.
Okay.
I've never heard of any. Well, there may be one possibility, but I think that was in a Russian drone, not a Iranian one. That was a GPS chip that was a design that was sold to the Russians by Israel, that the Russians then manufactured and used in their drones. So yes, in that sense, to the Russian drone, the answer is yes. But beyond that, I don't know if anything.
So then again, that goes to the question of keeping your technology away from enemies and potential enemies. Two side questions. Is there any evidence that the Iranians have used drones, not combat drones, but drones, to monitor the people in Iran in the revolution that we hope succeeds?
I don't think they're that good with their drones yet to follow people. That's fairly sophisticated. You typically what you do is you look for their cell phone and then you track them by cell phone. You can do it overhead very efficiently. We can do it for sure, but I'm not sure the Iranians can.
Okay, and the other is about North Korea. Do they have any inputs anywhere into this problem, or is that outside of their?
I haven't seen any evidence of the North Koreans with any important drone technology of any kind. It doesn't mean they don't have any, but I haven't seen it.
They're too busy with ballistic.
Well, they're too busy getting ready for a nuclear test to mess up things in Asia.
Right. Someone wrote to us, aside from articles like yours, and by the way, I think we're going to post Steve's latest article on our website, so you'll be able to see it at Insight. But aside from articles like yours, have the American media largely missed this story? I mean, we haven't seen much about this. And if they have, why have they? Is this an effort to, I don't know, protect an administration that isn't doing anything about a problem, or are they just missing it?
I don't think they're just missing it. I mean, typically reporters that write in the Western press get their cues from the government. The government says, well, oh yeah, there's a lot of American parts in well, our government's not going to say that. They're not going to say it because they'd be embarrassed to say it. So they haven't written about it. Actually, today's Wall Street Journal has an article. It's important for the Wall Street Journal to write that. I've been writing it for months. And other people have written about it as well. Small War Journal, for example, and places like that. So it's good that the Wall Street Journal, it's a mainline and important newspaper, is writing the story so people are aware of what's going on. And I think, it's really important for our government to deal with this and not to sit on its hands and pretend it didn't happen.
And in that regard, has anybody that you know of spoken with Mitt Romney about Bain Capital's participation in this? And along with that question goes another question. Do we have conflict of interest rules for people on the Hill about what they invest in that might impact American security?
Well, he did that before he was a senator.
I realize I'm not saying that he's.
I don't have any. I don't think that's what I wanted to show is that this is, maybe Mitt Romney should listen to this broadcast and say, hey, really, that was my baby. I put that, it was very successful. Bain Capital is a big deal. So maybe I'm going to tell them to get on the stick here and let's stop it. That would be terrific if Mitt Romney would do that. I hope he will.
And he might, if he knows. I mean, as you say, he did Bain Capital many years ago, and he may not be intimately familiar with the things it's doing now. He's got other things,
Yeah, but he was co-founder, so he knows. He surely has some idea about what the company does. I mean, and he's going to have a lot of influence as a U.S. senator, and it would be great if he would step in now and say, we own this company. Let's make them follow the rules.
Let's make them pro-American.
That'd be nice.
So we're coming to the end of the program, and people who listen regularly or even periodically know that I like to go out with a question, the answer to which leaves us on an optimistic or positive note. We have had none of that so far today. We have had nothing positive. We have had nothing optimistic. I'm ready to get under my desk. So let's try for a closer that works better.
Well, the closer is that we can, we have the ability to impact and stop, I believe, Iran's drone program and maybe many other military programs in Iran, because there's this big network out there that they must depend on for their systems, for their warfighting equipment. So this is a great opportunity, positive opportunity for the United States and for our allies to really step up and get the job done.
Positive opportunity, optimistic moment.
There you go.
Yes, any chance that the new House of Representatives under different leadership will take this up as an issue? Is that an optimistic thing we might look toward?
It is, and I'll be very happy to testify there.
I think they're going to call you. They're probably watching this program.
Let's hope so.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Steve Bryen, thank you for an enlightening, if depressing, program. We need it. We need to understand what our government is doing. We need to understand the capabilities our adversaries have. We need to understand where we fall short sometimes as a country. So this has been terrific. We really appreciate the time and appreciate having you with us.
Pleasure.
We are off next week for Thanksgiving. We'll see you in 2. And Everybody have a good, safe, happy, healthy holiday. And again, Steve, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.